Something has shifted, though it would be difficult to point to a single moment where it happened. There was no argument, no sudden loss, no sharp interruption that announced itself as a turning point. Life still looks mostly the same from the outside. The days still move forward. The body still wakes up in the morning and goes to bed at night. Conversations still happen. Decisions are still being made. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, in the quiet space where certainty used to live, there is a faint but persistent sense that something no longer belongs entirely to you. It arrives not as fear, but as a mild confusion. A pause where there used to be instinct. A hesitation where there used to be assumption. You notice it when you reach for something small and realize you did not decide it the way you used to. You cannot remember agreeing to give it up. You only know that it feels slightly out of reach now, as if it were moved while you were not looking. This is not the dramatic loss people talk about. This is quieter. It feels almost polite. It wears the disguise of concern and convenience. And because nothing painful announced its arrival, it takes time to recognize that something essential has already begun to loosen its grip. You start to sense it in the smallest places, in the way appointments are scheduled for you rather than with you, in the way someone asks how you are feeling but already has an answer prepared, in the subtle shift of tone when advice replaces curiosity. It does not feel hostile. In fact, it often feels caring. That is what makes it difficult to name. You are not being dismissed outright. You are being assisted. Help arrives before it is requested. Suggestions arrive framed as solutions. Decisions are softened with reassurance. It is all delivered gently enough that resistance feels unnecessary, even rude. And so you let it pass. You nod. You agree. You tell yourself it is easier this way. But somewhere inside, a quiet awareness begins to form. You feel less involved in the process of your own life, not excluded exactly, just slightly relocated, as if your role has been adjusted without your input. You are still present but no longer central, still respected but in a different way, a way that feels more like protection than partnership. At first, the changes seem practical. Someone offers to handle something you used to do yourself. Someone reminds you of something you never needed reminding of before. Someone double-checks your choices, not because they are wrong, but because they want to be sure. These moments arrive spaced far enough apart that they do not feel connected. Each one on its own seems reasonable, even thoughtful, and because there is no immediate harm, no obvious loss, you accept them without much reflection. But over time, a pattern begins to emerge, and it is not one of crisis. It is one of quiet substitution. Your judgment is slowly replaced by reassurance. Your preferences are slowly translated into recommendations. Your independence is slowly reinterpreted as something fragile. The language around you changes first. Words like, just to be safe, and it might be better if, and let me handle that for you, appear more frequently. They are never harsh. They are never commanding. They are simply persistent. And persistence has a way of reshaping reality without ever announcing itself as force. You notice it most clearly when you catch yourself seeking permission for things you once did without thinking. The question forms before you even realize it is there. Is this okay? Should I do this? Do you think it would be better if? These are not questions of incapacity. They are questions of alignment. You want to avoid friction. You want to show that you are reasonable. You want to demonstrate awareness of your age, your limits, your place, and so you consult, you check, you defer. It feels cooperative. It feels mature. It feels like adapting. Yet the more often you do it, the more distant your own authority begins to feel. It is still there, technically. No one has taken it from you outright, but it is no longer the first voice you listen to. It has become one opinion among others, sometimes the least trusted one. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when the internal balance shifts, when your own sense of what feels right is quietly outweighed by what others feel comfortable with. It does not happen because you suddenly doubt yourself. It happens because doubt is introduced from the outside in such subtle ways that it begins to feel like your own. Someone worries, someone cautions, someone reminds you of your age, your history, your risks. None of it is untrue. That is the most effective part. The facts are real, the concern is genuine, but the conclusion is rarely discussed openly. It is implied. The conclusion is that you should be less decisive, less spontaneous, less firm. That autonomy now requires justification. That choice must be explained. That independence is something you must earn repeatedly, rather than something that is assumed. What makes this shift particularly difficult to resist is that it does not feel like loss. It feels like relief. Fewer decisions to make, fewer things to manage, fewer responsibilities resting solely on your shoulders. There is comfort in that, especially after a lifetime of carrying weight. You tell yourself that you deserve the ease, that this is what later life is supposed to feel like, simpler, slower, supported. And for a while it does feel that way. The edges soften, the pressure lifts, but beneath that relief, something else begins to stir. A faint restlessness, a sense of being slightly misaligned with your own days. You find yourself going along with plans that do not quite feel like yours. You follow routines you did not design. You comply with structures that arrived quietly, without discussion. And because there is no obvious conflict, you say nothing. You assume this is normal. You assume this is how it goes. There is a particular loneliness that accompanies this stage, though it is rarely named. It is not the loneliness of isolation. People are still around. Conversations still happen. Help is still offered. But there is a growing distance between your inner life and the way others interact with you. They see a version of you that needs guidance, management, oversight. You still feel yourself to be the same person you have always been, shaped by experience, capable of judgment, aware of consequence. Yet the reflection you receive no longer matches that internal reality. And because the difference is subtle, you begin to question your own perception. Maybe they are right. Maybe things have changed more than you realized. Maybe it is time to step back. These thoughts do not arrive as conclusions. They arrive as suggestions. They hover, they wait, and over time they begin to feel familiar. The first real sign that something has shifted is often emotional rather than practical. A slight irritation when someone insists on helping. A quiet resentment when a decision is made without your input. A moment of sadness when you realize you were not consulted about something that directly affects you. These reactions surprise you because on the surface, nothing unfair has happened. No one intended harm. No one spoke unkindly. And so you suppress the feeling. You tell yourself you are being sensitive. You tell yourself it is not worth making an issue out of. You tell yourself that this is part of aging, and that resisting it would only make things harder. But the feeling does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of the background. A low hum of awareness that something important is being gradually reduced. You begin to notice how quickly the word safety appears in conversations about your choices. How easily it overrides preference. Safety is a powerful concept. It ends discussions, it justifies decisions, it frames opposition as irresponsibility. And once safety becomes the primary lens through which your life is viewed, autonomy quietly recedes. Because autonomy involves risk. It always has. Choosing for yourself means accepting uncertainty. It means living with consequence. When others begin to prioritize protection over participation, they do so with the best of intentions. But the result is a narrowing of your world, not through restriction, but through redirection. The range of acceptable choices shrinks. The default becomes caution. And slowly, without anyone saying so, your life begins to be treated as something that must be managed rather than lived. This is the stage where many people sense a loss but cannot articulate it. They feel less like the author of their days and more like a character being guided through them. They still make decisions, but those decisions occur within boundaries they did not set. The options presented feel curated, the alternatives quietly removed. And because the process is framed as helpful, questioning it feels ungrateful. So the awareness remains internal. It becomes a private reckoning, a series of small realizations that arrive late at night, or in moments of silence. The recognition that autonomy is not taken in one dramatic act. It is diluted, softened, reframed, until one day you look at your life and realize that while nothing has been forcibly removed, much has been gently replaced. There is no single villain in this story, no obvious betrayal. That is what makes it so difficult to confront. The people involved often believe they are doing the right thing. They are responding to narratives they themselves have inherited about age, capability, and decline. They are acting out scripts that society has written quietly and reinforced endlessly. And you too have absorbed those scripts. You have heard them for years. You have seen how others are treated once they cross an invisible line. You know what is expected. And so part of you participates in the process, even as another part resists it. This internal tension is exhausting. It requires constant negotiation. Do you assert yourself and risk being seen as difficult? Or do you remain silent and preserve harmony at the cost of something unnamed? The awareness grows slowly. It does not arrive as anger. It arrives as clarity. A dawning recognition that the loss of autonomy does not begin with nursing homes or legal documents or major interventions. It begins with language, with tone, with assumptions, with the quiet shift from being asked to being told, from being consulted to being informed. It begins when your no is treated as something that must be overcome rather than respected. When your yes is accepted only if it aligns with someone else's comfort. And by the time the larger decisions appear on the horizon, much of the internal groundwork has already been laid. The sense of authority you once felt over your own life has been slowly eroded, not by force but by familiarity. This realization is unsettling, but it is also precise. It sharpens your perception. You begin to see the pattern not as a personal failure, but as a process, one that operates quietly, efficiently, and with social approval. You understand now that autonomy is not lost in a single moment of weakness. It is surrendered in small increments, often in exchange for peace. And while nothing catastrophic has happened yet, you can feel the trajectory, the direction of travel, the subtle repositioning of yourself within your own life. This is not the end of anything, but it is the beginning of awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, does not leave easily. Once the awareness settles, it begins to rearrange how past moments are remembered. Things that once felt isolated now line up. Small exchanges return with new clarity. You start to recognize that what you experienced was not coincidence, but repetition. The same tone, the same phrases, the same logic appearing again and again, always wrapped in concern, always framed as reasonable. You see how easily help slides into direction, and how direction hardens into expectation. It is not announced. It is assumed. Someone steps in before you step forward. Someone answers a question that was never asked. Someone explains what would be best without first asking what you want. And because these gestures are calm and polite, they rarely provoke resistance. They invite agreement. They create an atmosphere where saying no feels unnecessary, even inappropriate. You begin to recognize that control rarely arrives as command. It arrives as care. It disguises itself as efficiency. It wears the language of responsibility. And because it does not evidence itself as power, it passes unnoticed, accumulating quietly over time. You notice how often decisions are framed in terms of convenience for others rather than meaning for you. The conversation does not center on what you value, but on what would be easier, safer, more practical. These words appear again and again, always justified, always sensible. Practical becomes the highest virtue, and practicality, when left unquestioned, has a way of flattening complexity. It reduces life to logistics. It replaces lived preference with manageable outcomes. You start to see how often your own perspective is filtered through someone else's interpretation before it is acted upon. You say something, it is received, it is adjusted, then it is returned to you in a slightly altered form, and over time, you begin to accept that version as the one that matters. This is not because you agree with it fully, but because the effort required to correct it feels heavier than the consequence of letting it pass. So you let it pass, again and again, until the habit of correction weakens and the habit of acceptance strengthens. The language of concern becomes increasingly familiar. It carries with it an unspoken authority. When someone says they are worried, the conversation shifts. Your reasoning becomes secondary. Your confidence is reframed as risk. Your history of judgment is acknowledged politely and then set aside. Concern, once expressed, grants permission. Permission to intervene, permission to override, permission to decide. And because concern is socially protected, questioning it feels like rejection. You do not want to seem ungrateful. You do not want to appear reckless. You do not want to cause tension. So you adapt your responses, you soften your stance, you explain yourself more than you used to, you justify choices that once required no explanation at all, and with each justification, something subtle changes. Authority moves outward. Validation becomes external. You begin to notice that decisions feel incomplete until they are approved by someone else. You recognize patterns in how conversations end. They end not with agreement, but with reassurance. Someone assures you that everything is taken care of, that you do not need to worry, that they have handled it. And while reassurance is meant to soothe, it also signals conclusion. It closes the door. It removes the need for further discussion. You realize how often your role in these moments is passive. You are informed after the fact. You are thanked for understanding. You are told it was all done with you in mind. And this phrase, "with you in mind," becomes a refrain. It sounds inclusive, it sounds respectful, but it often arrives without your involvement. It becomes a substitute for consent. And slowly, without explicit agreement, your life begins to be arranged around you rather than with you. You begin to see how age subtly alters the assumptions others bring into interactions. Not openly, not aggressively, just enough to shift the balance. Questions are simplified, options are narrowed, explanations are delivered with a slightly slower cadence. There is an underlying implication that too much complexity would be burdensome, that fewer choices would be kinder, and because no one says this outright, you are left to interpret it on your own. You wonder if they see something you do not. You wonder if perhaps you have changed more than you realize. Doubt creeps in quietly, not because of evidence, but because of repetition. When enough people treat you as though your capacity is diminishing, it becomes difficult not to internalize the suggestion. Even when you feel sharp, even when your mind remains clear, even when your instincts are intact. The external narrative begins to exert pressure on the internal one. You start to recognize how routines are introduced as solutions. Structure is offered as support. Predictability is framed as protection. None of this is inherently harmful, but you notice how quickly routine can become replacement, how a fixed schedule can crowd out spontaneity, how repeated patterns can reduce opportunity for choice. You are told when things will happen, how they will happen, what will be included, and because the structure functions smoothly, it feels efficient. It removes friction, it prevents problems, but it also removes participation. You become an object moving through a system rather than an agent shaping experience. And because the system works, questioning it feels unnecessary. You tell yourself this is just organization, that this is how things are done. Yet something inside resists the totality of it, not loudly, just persistently. You begin to see how often decisions are framed as inevitable, as if there is only one reasonable path forward. Alternatives are mentioned briefly, if at all, and then dismissed with logic that feels difficult to argue against. This would be safer, that would be simpler. This would avoid complications. The reasoning is sound, the tone is calm, and so you acquiesce. But you start to notice that inevitability is often constructed, not discovered. It is shaped by priorities that are not always yours. What is considered safest may not be what feels most alive. What is considered simplest may not be what preserves meaning. But those values are rarely weighed equally. Safety and simplicity dominate, and slowly, the range of what is considered acceptable for you narrows further. You recognize that help often arrives without a clear exit. Once someone begins handling something for you, it becomes the default. The original transfer is temporary, but the continuation is assumed. You are not asked if you want to take it back. The arrangement persists until you actively disrupt it. And disruption carries social cost. It requires explanation. It invites concern. It triggers questions. So you let it continue. And over time, you forget what it felt like to manage that aspect of your life yourself. Not because you cannot, but because you have not. Familiarity shifts. Dependency grows quietly, not through incapacity, but through convenience. And the longer it persists, the more difficult it feels to reclaim without appearing ungrateful or impractical. You begin to notice how often your preferences are reframed as preferences of others. You say you like something. It is noted, but when decisions are made, what appears is what others think you should like. What would be good for you? What fits the plan? And when there is a discrepancy, it is smoothed over. You are told it is close enough, that you will adapt, that you will get used to it, and often you do. Humans are adaptable. That is part of the problem. Adaptation can mask loss. You adjust, you accommodate. You find ways to be content within constraints you did not choose. And because you succeed in adapting, the original loss remains unexamined. You recognize how often your silence is interpreted as agreement. There is little room left for neutrality. If you do not object, it is assumed you consent. If you do not intervene, it is assumed you approve. And because objecting requires energy, and energy is increasingly treated as something you should conserve, silence becomes the default. You conserve, you comply, you let others lead. And each time this happens, the pattern reinforces itself. Others become more comfortable deciding, you become more accustomed to being decided for. The roles settle into place without discussion, without intention, without ceremony. You see now how easily identity begins to shift under these conditions. You are no longer primarily seen as someone who decides, but as someone who is considered. This may sound respectful, but it carries a different weight. To be considered is not the same as to choose. To be cared for is not the same as to be consulted. And while both can coexist, the balance has tilted. You begin to sense that your presence in decision-making spaces is symbolic rather than functional. You are included in form, but not in outcome. You are asked how you feel, but not what you want. And when your feelings complicate the plan, they are acknowledged and then set aside. This recognition is not dramatic. It is sobering. It strips away the illusion that autonomy disappears because of incapacity alone. You see now that it is often eroded through social choreography, through well-meaning adjustments, through repeated assumptions, through the quiet belief that easing your burden justifies removing your choice. And the most unsettling part is realizing how easily you participated in this process. Not because you were weak, but because you were cooperative, because you valued harmony, because you did not want to be difficult, because you believed that love and control were opposites, when in reality they often arrive intertwined. You begin to understand that what is happening is not about any single decision. It is about position, your position within conversations, within planning, within the future imagined for you. You are slowly being repositioned from subject to object, from agent to beneficiary, from decision-maker to concern. And this repositioning is happening not through confrontation, but through accommodation. It is happening quietly, steadily, with the full approval of those involved. And because it is happening under the banner of care, it feels almost impossible to challenge without seeming ungrateful or unreasonable. This is the stage where recognition sharpens into discomfort. You can no longer unsee the pattern. You see it in how quickly your resistance is met with reassurance rather than dialogue. You see it in how often your confidence is interpreted as denial. You see it in how rarely your autonomy is treated as something that might coexist with risk. And while nothing has been formally taken from you, you can feel the ground shifting. The center of gravity of your life is moving outward. And though the movement is slow, its direction is unmistakable. There comes a point when recognition hardens into weight. Not a sudden collapse, not grief in its obvious form, but a steady heaviness that settles into the chest and stays there. You begin to feel it in how you are addressed, how conversations now orbit around you instead of including you. The tone shifts first, slightly softer, slightly slower. Words are chosen with care, as if you might break under directness. You are spoken to with reassurance embedded in every sentence, even when none is required. And because this shift is framed as kindness, reacting to it feels inappropriate. You tell yourself you are imagining it. You tell yourself people are simply being considerate, but the feeling persists. You are no longer spoken to as someone whose authority is assumed. You are spoken to as someone whose comfort must be managed. And that distinction, once noticed, is impossible to ignore. It changes how you hear everything that follows. You begin to sense that your presence in rooms has changed. You are still welcomed, still greeted warmly, still included. But inclusion now feels ceremonial. You are there to be acknowledged, not to shape direction. Decisions are discussed in your presence, but rarely paused for your input. When you do speak, the room listens politely, then moves on. Your words are not challenged or debated. They are absorbed, smoothed, and quietly bypassed. There is something more painful about this than outright disagreement. Disagreement would at least confirm relevance. What you experience instead is gentle irrelevance, a soft sidelining that leaves no clear edge to push against. You are not excluded. You are simply no longer central. This repositioning carries an emotional cost that is difficult to articulate. It is not humiliation. It is not anger. It is a sense of shrinking, of being slowly compressed into a narrower version of yourself. You begin to notice how often your opinions are treated as expressions rather than directives, as feelings rather than conclusions. You say what you think, and it is acknowledged as perspective, not authority. Someone nods, someone says that makes sense, and then the plan proceeds unchanged. You are heard but not followed, respected but not deferred to. And over time, this pattern begins to erode something internal. You stop expecting to be influential. You adjust your expectations downward. You begin to speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you have learned that saying it rarely alters the outcome. The emotional weight deepens when you realize that this shift is often justified by narratives about your own good. People speak of what would be easier for you, safer for you, less stressful for you. These statements land differently now. They no longer feel protective. They feel prescriptive. You begin to sense that your tolerance for complexity, for challenge, for responsibility, is being underestimated. And because these judgments are rarely explicit, you are left to confront them internally. You wonder if perhaps you have become more fragile than you realize. You question your own resilience. You search for evidence that others might be right. And in doing so, you begin to participate in your own diminishment. Doubt does not arrive as self-criticism. It arrives as self-surveillance. You watch yourself more closely. You second-guess. You hesitate. There is a particular loss embedded in being managed instead of consulted. Consultation implies agency. It assumes that your input matters, that it will shape the outcome. Management assumes something else. It assumes a goal already defined, with your role limited to compliance or comfort. When you are consulted, you are invited into uncertainty. When you are managed, uncertainty has already been resolved by someone else. And while this can feel efficient, it also feels alienating. You begin to feel like a variable to be controlled rather than a person to be engaged. Your preferences are factored in, but only insofar as they do not disrupt the plan. And when they do, they are gently overridden in the name of practicality. You feel this loss most acutely in moments when you realize you were not asked about something that affects your daily life. The decision has already been made. The arrangements are already in place. You are informed afterward, often with an explanation designed to reassure you. This is what we thought would be best. This will make things easier. This way you will not have to worry. The language is careful. The intent is clear. But the omission is glaring. You were not part of the process. Your life has been adjusted without your participation, and while you may not object outright, something inside recoils, not because the decision is necessarily wrong, but because the right to decide was quietly assumed by someone else. There is grief in realizing that your autonomy is now conditional, that it is granted selectively, depending on context and perceived risk. You are free to choose within safe boundaries, but those boundaries are no longer self-defined. They are negotiated externally, and the criteria for negotiation are opaque. You are not told exactly when your choices will be questioned or overridden. You learn through experience, through subtle resistance, through redirected conversations, through plans that solidify despite your hesitation. This unpredictability creates a low-level anxiety. You are never quite sure when your authority will be honored, and when it will be gently bypassed. And living in that uncertainty is exhausting. You begin to notice how this dynamic alters your sense of self. You become more cautious, more measured, less inclined to assert. Not because you lack conviction, but because you anticipate friction. You anticipate concern. You anticipate the look that says, "Are you sure?" And so you preemptively adjust. You simplify your desires. You soften your language. You present your choices in ways that sound reasonable to others. You frame them as modest, as sensible, as aligned with expectations. In doing so, you preserve harmony, but you also dilute authenticity. You begin to lose touch with what you want when no one else is watching. The loss is compounded by the realization that strength is often mistaken for denial. When you express confidence, it is sometimes met with worry. When you assert independence, it is interpreted as resistance to reality. You are reminded of your age, your limitations, your history. These reminders are rarely malicious. They are offered as context, but they carry an implicit message that your self-assessment cannot be fully trusted, that others see risks you are overlooking. And while this may sometimes be true, it becomes a default assumption rather than a situational consideration. Your competence is no longer presumed. It must be demonstrated repeatedly, and even then, it may not be fully accepted. There is a quiet humiliation in this, though it is rarely acknowledged as such. Not the humiliation of being openly dismissed, but the humiliation of being subtly underestimated, of having your capacity questioned without direct challenge, of feeling that your long history of decision-making has been quietly discounted. You carry decades of experience, of problem-solving, of adaptation. You have navigated complexity, survived uncertainty, made mistakes and learned from them. Yet now those experiences seem to hold less weight than current perceptions. You are defined more by what you might lose than by what you still possess. And this redefinition feels deeply unfair, even when it is delivered gently. The emotional loss extends into how you see your future. Plans are no longer framed around growth or exploration, but around maintenance and containment. The goal becomes stability rather than possibility, comfort rather than meaning. And while comfort has value, it is not sufficient on its own. You begin to sense that your future is being imagined in smaller terms, that expectations have narrowed, that the horizon has been brought closer. And because this imagining often happens without your explicit involvement, you feel displaced from your own forward trajectory. Your life is being steered toward an endpoint that you did not choose, even if it is described as inevitable. You feel this most strongly when the subject of living arrangements arises, even indirectly. The language becomes particularly careful. Options are presented as necessities. Preferences are reframed as impractical. Independence is treated as admirable but unrealistic. The conversation often centers on what will be easier for others to manage, what will reduce worry, what will prevent future problems. And while these concerns are valid, they dominate the discussion to the exclusion of your inner life, your sense of place, your attachment to autonomy, your need for self-direction. These are acknowledged in passing, then outweighed by logistical considerations, and in that weighing, something essential is lost. The loss is not only external, it begins to internalize. You start to anticipate the eventual surrender of more choices. You imagine the day when resistance will no longer feel worth the effort, when acquiescence will seem simpler than assertion. This anticipation creates a quiet sadness, not because the outcome is certain, but because the direction feels set. You feel yourself being prepared, slowly and subtly, for a role you did not audition for. A role defined by dependency, compliance, and gratitude, and while you understand the social logic behind it, you feel its emotional cost acutely. There is a particular pain in realizing that dignity often fades before strength, that the erosion of agency can begin while capacity remains. You are still able, still aware, still engaged, yet you are treated as though the transition has already begun, as though the future has arrived early. And because this treatment is normalized, you are left to carry the dissonance alone. You feel capable, but you are handled as fragile. You feel autonomous, but you are managed as vulnerable. This gap between internal reality and external treatment creates a fracture that is difficult to reconcile. You begin to mourn the version of yourself that moved through the world unquestioned, the version that made decisions without explanation, that was trusted by default, that was assumed competent until proven otherwise. This mourning is quiet, it has no ritual, no acknowledgement. It is not recognized by others, because from their perspective, nothing has been taken. You still have choices. You are still included. You are still cared for. But you know that something has changed fundamentally. The ground beneath your autonomy has softened. It no longer feels solid. And standing on it requires more effort than it once did. This loss is cumulative. Each small concession adds weight to the next. Each unchallenged decision makes future challenges feel harder. And over time you begin to feel tired, not physically but existentially, tired of explaining, tired of negotiating, tired of asserting what once required no defense. This fatigue is dangerous because it makes surrender feel appealing, not because you agree with it, but because you are weary of resistance, and this is often the moment when the final repositioning becomes possible. Not through force, but through exhaustion. You do not rage against this process. You do not rebel. You simply feel the narrowing, the quiet closing in, the sense that your life is being gently guided toward containment. And while no single moment justifies alarm, the accumulation creates a profound sense of loss. Loss of voice, loss of authorship, loss of the feeling that you are steering your own existence. This is not the loss of independence in its dramatic form. It is the loss of self-direction, and it is felt deeply, even when it is never spoken aloud. At some point, the weight stops pressing downward and begins to clarify instead. Not because anything improves on the surface, but because something inside settles into a quieter, sharper understanding. The struggle softens not into surrender, but into recognition of where the true boundary has always been. You begin to see that much of what has been taken was never seized directly. It was offered back to you in altered form, and you accepted it gradually, often without noticing the exchange. This realization does not arrive with anger. It arrives with sobriety, a calm assessment of what has been lost externally and what has remained untouched internally. You start to sense that while circumstances have narrowed, something essential has not been breached, and that distinction matters more than you once believed. You recognize that autonomy was never only about logistics or physical independence. It was never limited to where you live, how you move, or who assists you. Those are expressions of autonomy, not its source. The source has always been internal. It has always lived in how you interpret, how you consent, how you accept or refuse meaning. This does not make external losses insignificant. It simply reframes their power. You begin to see that others can rearrange your environment, influence your routines, and even limit your options. But they cannot decide what those changes mean to you unless you allow them to. This understanding does not restore what has been lost, but it stabilizes what remains. It gives you ground to stand on that is not dependent on permission. You notice a subtle shift in how you listen. Where once reassurance felt dismissive, now it feels informative. Where concern once felt intrusive, now it feels optional. You begin to hear what is being said without immediately internalizing its judgment. You recognize that much of what others project onto you is shaped by their own fears, their own narratives about aging and decline. These narratives no longer feel authoritative, they feel external. You stop measuring yourself against them, not through defiance, but through disengagement. You let the words pass without letting them define you. This detachment is not indifference, it is discernment. You choose what to absorb and what to leave untouched. Clarity brings with it a reassessment of consent. You begin to see how often you said yes, not because you agreed, but because you wanted to avoid friction. You recognize that compliance was mistaken for peace. And while peace has value, it is not neutral. It always costs something. With this clarity, you start to reclaim small internal refusals, not spoken aloud, not announced, simply held. You may still comply outwardly. You may still accept help. But internally, you stop interpreting these moments as evidence of diminishment. You stop narrating them as proof that you are losing yourself. Instead, you begin to see them as transactions, not definitions. Circumstances change. Selfhood does not have to. You realize that much of the fear surrounding loss of autonomy comes from the belief that dignity depends on control over outcomes. That if you cannot dictate the shape of your life, you have failed in some fundamental way. This belief softens under scrutiny. You begin to see dignity as something quieter, less visible, more resilient. It does not announce itself through authority or independence alone. It resides in how you inhabit whatever position you find yourself in. Whether you are deciding or being decided for, dignity lives in your internal posture. in whether you still recognize yourself as the author of meaning, even when you are no longer the author of structure. You begin to understand that power shifts are inevitable. Bodies change, contexts narrow, social roles evolve. Fighting these realities directly often leads to bitterness. Accepting them uncritically leads to erasure. Clarity lies between these extremes. You stop asking how to regain control and start asking where control still exists. You find it in interpretation, in memory, in values that remain intact regardless of circumstance. You find it in the ability to observe what is happening without collapsing into it. This observation creates distance, and distance creates choice, even when options are limited. You notice that while others may assume your future, they cannot dictate your inner allegiance to that future. You do not have to internalize their timelines or their endpoints. You can acknowledge practical realities without surrendering your sense of self to them. This distinction becomes increasingly important as conversations turn toward inevitability. You hear phrases about what will happen eventually, about what makes sense in the long run. You no longer feel compelled to argue. You also no longer feel compelled to agree. You allow inevitability to remain hypothetical. You focus instead on the present moment, where autonomy still expresses itself quietly through attention, through choice of thought, through refusal to prematurely identify with a role you have not yet been forced to inhabit. Clarity also brings compassion, though not the kind directed outward. It is compassion toward yourself. You recognize that your earlier compliance was not weakness, it was strategy. It was an attempt to preserve harmony, to protect relationships, to avoid conflict. You stop judging yourself for it. Judgment would only deepen the loss. Instead, you acknowledge the context in which those choices were made. You see that survival often requires adaptation, and adaptation often looks like concession. This does not negate your agency, it demonstrates it. You chose peace when it mattered. Now you choose awareness. You begin to disentangle identity from role. You are no longer defined solely by how others position you. You see that roles are assigned externally, but identity is maintained internally. You may be treated as dependent without becoming dependent in spirit. You may be managed without becoming managed in thought. This separation is subtle, but it is powerful. It allows you to participate in systems without being consumed by them. You stop equating cooperation with surrender. You stop equating assistance with erasure. You hold the line quietly, internally, without needing validation. You also recognize that clarity does not require confrontation. In fact, confrontation often feeds the very narratives you wish to escape. It reinforces the image of fragility or denial. Quiet clarity operates differently. It does not seek to persuade. It does not demand recognition. It simply refuses to collapse inward. You allow others to think what they will. You no longer feel compelled to correct their assumptions. You conserve your energy for something more essential, for maintaining coherence between who you are and how you experience yourself. This clarity changes how you experience limitation. Limitations no longer feel like verdicts. They feel like conditions. Conditions can be worked with. They can be navigated. They do not define essence. You begin to see that autonomy was never about having unlimited options. It was about choosing how to relate to whatever options exist. That capacity remains, even in constrained circumstances, even when choices are narrowed, even when others decide logistics. You still choose orientation. You still choose interpretation. You still choose what you respect within yourself. You begin to sense that the greatest loss would not be moving into a smaller physical space or accepting more help. The greatest loss would be internal abdication. The moment you stop seeing yourself as capable of judgment, the moment you stop trusting your own inner compass, that is the threshold that matters, and it is one you have not crossed. You see now that much of what frightened you was the assumption that external control automatically erodes internal authority. That assumption dissolves under clarity. External changes are real. Internal authority is optional. It must be surrendered consciously. It cannot be taken quietly. This realization does not restore the world you once knew. It does not reverse the shifts in how others see you. But it restores something more fundamental, a sense of alignment. You feel less fragmented, less reactive. You no longer interpret every adjustment as a threat. You assess. You choose what to internalize. You allow what cannot be changed to pass through without redefining you. This is not resignation, it is composure. You understand now that autonomy, in its most durable form, is not visible. It does not announce itself through independence alone. It expresses itself through restraint, through the refusal to internalize diminishment, through the quiet maintenance of self-respect regardless of circumstance. This clarity does not need acknowledgement. It does not seek permission. It simply exists, steady and intact, beneath whatever structures are placed around you. And in this clarity something settles. Not hope, not optimism, just steadiness. A recognition of what can be influenced and what must be observed. You are no longer disoriented by the slow shifts around you. You see them clearly. You understand their mechanics, and most importantly, you understand where they end. They end at the boundary of your inner consent. And that boundary, once recognized, becomes firm again, not loudly, not visibly, but unmistakably. Something quiet changes when that boundary becomes familiar, not visible from the outside, not announced in behavior or tone. It is an internal posture that settles into place and stays there. You stop bracing yourself against what may come. You stop rehearsing arguments that no longer need to be spoken. You stop trying to prove anything. What emerges instead is a calm ownership of yourself that does not depend on circumstances aligning in your favor. You no longer measure autonomy by how much control you are granted. You measure it by how little of yourself you give away internally. This shift is subtle, but it is decisive. It changes how you move through what remains. Quiet autonomy does not look like resistance. It does not look like independence in its loud, youthful form. It does not insist on doing everything alone. It accepts help without absorbing the story that help implies inadequacy. You allow others to assist without allowing them to redefine you. You cooperate without collapsing. You participate without surrendering authorship of meaning. This balance feels almost invisible to others, and that is its strength. Nothing about it invites correction or concern. There is no performance to misinterpret. You simply remain intact. You begin to notice that your inner reactions soften. When decisions are made around you, you no longer experience the same sting. Not because the loss is imaginary, but because it no longer reaches as deeply. You recognize what is external and what is not. You no longer argue internally with every outcome. You assess, you accept what cannot be changed, and you quietly retain what still belongs to you. Your sense of self stops oscillating in response to others' actions. It becomes steadier, less reactive. You are no longer waiting for recognition of your autonomy. You are living it privately. This private ownership reshapes how you experience time. You stop projecting yourself into futures imagined by others. You no longer inhabit the role they prepare you for before it arrives. You stay where you are, in the present, in the body you still inhabit, in the mind that still works, in the values that remain yours. You understand that much of what erodes dignity happens in anticipation rather than reality. People surrender agency early, rehearsing dependency long before it is required. You do not participate in that rehearsal. You let the future arrive on its own terms. Until then, you remain where choice still exists, however limited it may be. Quiet autonomy also alters how you relate to silence. Silence no longer feels like erasure. It becomes space. You no longer feel compelled to fill it with explanations or justifications. You allow others to speak. You allow plans to unfold. You do not rush to correct every assumption. This restraint is not passive, it is deliberate. You conserve your energy for what matters internally. You choose not to engage in battles that would only reinforce the perception that you are resisting reality. You let reality exist without letting it define you prematurely. You notice that dignity begins to reassert itself in small, almost imperceptible ways. In how you carry yourself internally, in how you interpret what happens to you. You stop framing acceptance as defeat. You stop equating adaptation with disappearance. You understand that flexibility has always been one of your strengths. You have adapted before many times in far harsher circumstances. This is no different. What is different is the awareness you bring to it. You adapt without internal submission. You adjust without relinquishing self-respect. You begin to experience a different kind of freedom. Not freedom of movement or authority, but freedom from internal negotiation. You no longer debate your worth with yourself. You no longer question whether you are still entitled to judgment. You assume it quietly. You trust your perceptions again, even when they are not acted upon externally. This trust stabilizes you. It creates a sense of continuity between who you have been and who you are now. You do not feel split between past and present. You feel whole even as circumstances shift. Quiet autonomy also changes how you experience care from others. You receive it without resentment. You accept concern without internalizing its implications. You understand that people act from their own fears as much as from love. You do not take responsibility for those fears. You let them exist without letting them dictate your internal narrative. This creates emotional distance without emotional coldness. You remain connected without being absorbed. You stay present without being managed internally. There is a particular strength in refusing the role assigned to you without announcing the refusal. You do not argue against being seen as fragile. You simply do not see yourself that way. You do not insist on being treated as capable. You quietly remain capable within yourself. Over time, this internal consistency becomes evident in subtle ways, not through confrontation, but through steadiness. People sense that you are not easily moved internally. They may not articulate it. They may not even consciously register it. But it alters how they engage with you. Not dramatically, just enough. You understand now that nursing homes, institutions, and final arrangements are not the beginning of loss. They are outcomes. What matters most happens long before that, in the quiet erosion of inner authority. And that erosion is not inevitable. You may not control where you live forever. You may not control who assists you. But you can control whether you arrive at those places internally intact or internally diminished. You choose the former, not through resistance, but through presence. Quiet autonomy does not seek to escape dependency if dependency arrives. It seeks to remain sovereign within it. You may accept limits without identifying with them. You may be assisted without becoming small. You may be guided without losing direction. This internal sovereignty is not visible. It will not be praised. It will not be noticed by systems designed to manage bodies rather than selves, but it will be felt by you, and that is enough. You stop imagining autonomy as something to defend. Defense implies threat. Threat implies fear. You are no longer afraid. Not because nothing can be taken, but because you understand what cannot. You understand that the last territory is internal, and that territory is entered only by consent. You do not give that consent lightly anymore. You guard it quietly, without ceremony. In this posture, you no longer feel the need to declare independence. Declarations invite response. They create friction. Quiet autonomy avoids both. It simply exists. It is carried in how you think, how you interpret, how you remain aligned with yourself even as roles shift around you. It is not defiant. It is not dramatic. It is stable. You are no longer measuring your life against what it used to be. You are no longer mourning each adjustment as evidence of decline. You see the arc clearly now. You understand how autonomy is lost quietly, and therefore how it is preserved quietly as well. You do not cling, you do not surrender. You remain, and in remaining, you reclaim something essential, not control, not independence in its old form, but authorship of self, the ability to inhabit whatever comes without being rewritten by it. This is not something that can be taken away by care, by concern, by institutions, or by time. It can only be relinquished internally. You do not relinquish it. Nothing about this needs to be said aloud. Nothing about it needs validation. It is enough that you know where you stand, that you recognize the line that matters, that you remain on your side of it quietly, steadily, without announcement. This is quiet autonomy.